with all of his freaks, and they literally get hired to show up at the first Birds gigs at the Whiskey A Go Go and other places on the Sunset Strip. And they show up and they start doing these freak dances. And they're paid to go there. They're paid to be this crowd. And it's all part of this push to launch a counterculture scene.
Yeah.
And he gets and there's a lot of dark stuff around this guy. And we're talking like, sacrifices and kids that die. I mean, things that you don't really want to read about. He leaves the country. And who comes in? The next guy to come in to take up residence in that house is Frank Zappa. And Frank Zappa is, a very strange cat. Frank Zappa's father was a chemical engineer for a company that made weapons. And Frank Zappa is, Frank Zappa's politics were incredibly conservative. And I've never been a huge fan of his music, by the way, but a lot of people love Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa was kind of like a dictator. I mean, he was kind of like, if you wanted to have somebody that could, kind of run a cult and be a dictator, Frank Zappa would hit almost every single milestone for that.
Yeah.
And then Frank Zappa sort of he's occupying this house on Laurel Canyon. Well, just as he's leaving, guess who comes in? The next guy in his trinity is Charles Manson.
Right.
So it starts with this Vetus Caucus guy, and then winds up with Manson. And Dave McGowan details all this in his The Secret History of Laurel Canyon, which I highly recommend, and you would love it, Katie.
Yeah, no, I would love it. I can already tell I'm already thinking about going and fishing it out on Amazon.
It's actually, he didn't publish this. It's on his website.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and Dave McGowan is a brilliant researcher, and I would love to have him on the show one of the day. He also gets into the moon landing stuff, and he's one of these guys that is an evidence-based guy, and his ability to scour birth records and family trees and genealogy is really without match on the internet. I think he's one of the best.
Yeah, interesting. You'll have to give me the link.
Okay.
But regardless, this is even more stuff filling in. I just feel that the whole Manson thing, people were given this idea of the crazy guy, that was deranged and created a cult, and
right.
And it's a cover story. I mean, the whole thing is just a cover story for one of the tips of the iceberg of this big cesspool that is basically Hollywood and the entertainment industry, and it kind of even goes into the occult societies of LA. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
All of that kind of thing that nobody knows about, nobody's supposed to know about, and LA is a big deal because it's look at what it's doing now. It's like the culture shaper for youth and for the world even now, right? With the entertainment industry, in a way, it's getting even worse now because now they're not even bothering to cover up the rituals. Now the rituals are in your face.
Yeah, totally.
And we've talked about all of that ad nauseum, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of people doing research on that, and I think that most people are kind of switched on now to what is going on, at least the people like us, right? Like, they all know what's happening with regards to the music industry right now. But it really goes back as far back as the beginning of the 60s and all of this scenario. And it really is the case that none of that is what it seems. There was so much stuff going on and so much darker stuff going on behind the scenes than most of us ever realized looking back at that time period, right?
Yeah.
That when I was researching about Manson, I got into a little obsessive, I do this every now and then, I get obsessed about something. And then I don't leave it alone until I've turned all the stones I want to turn.
Right.
But I was kind of looking at his history, and he actually, what are the odds that this guy spent a year in that Boys Town place
Oh, right.
You know the one I'm talking about?
Sure.
Is it in Nebraska?
Nebraska, yeah.
In Nebraska, right?
Yeah.
When he was, because he was an orphan or a runaway of some kind,
Right.
and he actually spent 1 year of his life before he ended up in the whole, prison system and everything. He spent a year of his life in Boys Town.
Right.
How could that possibly be a coincidence?
Well,
how could it possibly? It's just not possible.
Well, it's really, what's interesting too is I'm looking at his chart, right?
Right.
And it's right in front of me, and he's got Pluto in the 4th house.
Right.
So I mean, you have Pluto and Cancer in the 4th house home. Pluto, that's dark, man. That's really dark.
Yeah.
And it opposes his true node and his moon, which are both conjunct in the 10th house. He's got a Grand Cross in his chart, by the way. And he has a scary amount of planets in Scorpio: Sun, Mercury, Venus, Jupiter, and they're all conjunct. With the exception of Mercury and the Sun, it's pretty far, but Mercury and Jupiter are conjunct in Scorpio. And then he's got Moon in Aquarius and Saturn in Aquarius, which are squaring most of those planets. So fixed signs, megalomaniacal, dark, intense, occultic. Mars conjunct Neptune in the 5th house, charismatic, using art to sway people.
Yeah, that's like the dark spiritual.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
The manipulator. Neptune Mars can be a supreme manipulator.
Yeah.
Right.
I've got a Neptune Mars
interesting character
going on right now. Yeah. Well, interesting is, I think, an understatement, but for sure, yeah.
In a bad kind of way, but interesting from a research point of view. Obviously,
he's only like 5'3". I mean, he's a really small guy.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget the what happened during the trial, the Manson trial, where he was on the stand and he was screaming at the judge, and the judge was banging his hammer, to calm him down, right? And he was the person who's testifying sits and where the judge sits is there's actually a fair amount of distance between those two spots. Where the judge sits above the person that's giving their testimony, the witness to the stand or whatever. And so there's a fair amount of distance. I think it's like, almost like 5 feet. And what Manson did during that heated exchange is he got out of his chair and was squatting on the little table, kind of the desk in front of him at the witness stand. He was squatting, and he had his finger up, and he's pointing his finger and shaking it at the judge and on his rant. And in a moment's notice, he went from a squat and he leapt up to where the judge sits and got in his face and started pointing his finger in the judge's face. Now, that is actually a pretty superhuman physical act.
Right.
To go from a squat and to leap straight up in the air and leap on. He didn't climb up. He leaped up in one motion. There may be a handful of people on the planet that could do that. Yeah.
Well, and it's interesting that you mentioned that because I was having a thought before you started with the story. I was having a thought and I was like, I'm not going to go there, right? But I am, because what you're saying is exactly tied into it. That is that one of the reasons for which, who knows who the real Charles Manson is.
Right.
Right. He may very well be a very traumatized, abused, fragmented individual that came out of the Boys Town orphanage and trauma training, right?
Yeah.
Okay. But by the time he becomes Charles Manson, and by the way, I think this phenomena is widespread, what I'm about to say. the people that have this magnetism and charisma, and it's a dark magnetism, right? But it's almost like you are still drawn and attracted to them in some ways because they ooze something magnetic, but you know it's a bad magnetism and you're supposed to stay away, right?
Yeah.
But there's the dark charisma of some kind, and it's the same thing that you see in Al Pacino. He has a dark charisma. That character is charismatic, right? That character has an allure, right? That is why Keanu Reeves goes with him. There's a seductiveness, let's call it that. It's a seductiveness, right, that some of these individuals have. I don't think that when there's an encounter with that kind of seductiveness, of that dark charisma, I don't think that we're actually dealing with a human being. I think that we're dealing with the demonic energies that are hosts of that body, right? Yeah. And I think that is the reason for which there's this magnetism coming through. I think it's also the reason for which Charles Manson can make that leap, okay? Because I was doing some research again about, you know, the dark astral and various things, and I came across a recording of a guy who was obviously a professional of some kind, and he had been from Montreal, I think, and he had been approached, right? And they were like, "Hey, we're going to church," kind of thing. That's how they cloaked it to him. "Do you want to come to this special church with us? And it's only for wealthy, influential people," and so on. And obviously he had risen enough in his profession that he had come under the attention of this group. And we've heard this story before, right? There's people that rise, they either make a lot of money or they become very famous for whatever reason, and then they get approached so that they can be assimilated into the pyramidal structure of the elite, even if it's not all the way to the top. They try to incorporate as many people as they can. So this guy's like, "Yeah, sure, why not? I'll come along." And so he goes, and he realizes that this is a satanic setup, right? And that these people are, he is not impressed at all by the whole thing, but goes along for a little bit. He even gets some threats about, you know, you have to stay, otherwise, you know, we will destroy you and your business and everything. So he gets some threats, and eventually he comes out anyway. But one of the things that he said was that one of the selling points that they gave to him about this belonging to this group was that then he would get supernatural powers that would come from the alliances with these entities, right? That these beings were also channeling in the same way that some of the New Agers, and not just New Agers, but some of the light people channel light beings, and some of them are authentic light beings, right? But these people were channeling dark beings. But not only that, they were also acquiring some various kinds of supernatural aid, right, through being associated to these things. And one of the things that he was saying was that they told him that, for example, there was this surgeon that could do these amazing surgeries because none of his clients would bleed during the surgery, because he had a being from the other side that obviously he had pledged allegiance to. And this being from the other side was making sure that nobody bled during his surgeries, in exchange for favors, of course, right? And so he could do surgeries that nobody else could do, because the bleeding out was not an issue, and therefore he was rising in stature, right? Because he was like, "Oh my God, this surgeon is so good, he can do surgeries that nobody else can do," and he was getting more and more power, right? So there's a real high strangeness, let's say,